Picture a man standing in the middle of a naval battle with a bottle of rum in one hand and a cutlass in the other. Cannonballs are tearing through the rigging above his head. Splinters the size of daggers are flying off the mast. The deck beneath him is slick with blood, gunpowder, and seawater. Men are screaming, falling, dying all around him. And this man, he is laughing. He doesn't duck. He doesn't run. He stumbles forward, takes another swig straight from the bottle, and grins at death like it's an old drinking buddy who showed up uninvited to ruin his evening. You're probably picturing Captain Jack Sparrow right now. The wobbling walk, the slurred wit, the uncanny, almost supernatural ability to survive absolutely anything through sheer, glorious incompetence. A man who falls off masts, gets shot at point-blank range, gets marooned on an island with nothing but sand and rum, and somehow always walks away with that same crooked grin. But here's what almost nobody tells you. That character wasn't invented in a writer's room in Burbank. He was built, piece by piece, out of real men who actually lived and actually died along the Caribbean coastline 300 years ago. Men who were so drunk, so reckless, so utterly unbothered by their own mortality that death itself seemed to lose interest in chasing them. Tonight we're going somewhere Disney never took you. We're going into the real, blood-soaked history behind the most famous pirate on the planet. We'll meet the disgraced English privateer who may have inspired his name and his fate. We'll meet the flamboyant thief whose luck was so absurd that sailors thought he was cursed or blessed by God himself. We'll meet the bearded demon who shot his own crewmen for entertainment. And we'll meet 52 condemned men who stood on a colonial gallows with a noose already around their neck, still drunk, still laughing, cracking jokes at the executioner, while a crowd of thousands watched in stunned, horrified silence. Was there really a pirate too drunk to die? Was the rum a joke, or was it the only thing keeping these men alive long enough to become legends? Stick around, because the answer is stranger, darker, and far more human than anything Hollywood ever dared to write. Before we sail any further into this story, if dark history and pirate legends are the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, hit subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss the next voyage into the past. Every legend has to start somewhere, and this one starts with a lie that's been repeated so many times it now feels like fact. Jack Sparrow feels like pure fiction, a cartoon built for laughs and eyeliner, and yet almost every piece of him traces back to a real person who bled, betrayed, converted, or hanged along the same stretch of ocean. Start with the walk, that famous drunken stagger, hips swaying, wrists dangling like he'd forgotten how joints work, fingers fluttering as if he's conducting an orchestra only he can hear. That wasn't written on a page by a screenwriter. It was borrowed wholesale from Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, a man who, by his own admission, had spent so many decades pickled in whiskey, and worse, that his body simply forgot how to move like other people's bodies moved. Richards even played Sparrow's father in the later films, a nod nobody in the audience was really supposed to catch. When Johnny Depp built the character, he built the body first, and he built it from rock and roll excess, not maritime history, but the soul of the character, the actual pirate underneath the swagger and the coal-rimmed eyes. That's where the story gets genuinely unsettling. Some historians point to a man named Jack Ward. He was an English privateer working in the late 1500s and early 1600s, a hardened Kentish fisherman turned sailor who eventually defected from English service, sailed for the Barbary coast of North Africa, and converted to Islam under the name Yusuf Rees. peace. He commanded a fleet out of Tunis, terrorized Christian shipping across the Mediterranean, and became so infamous that ballads were composed about him in English taverns while he was still very much alive to hear the rumors. One surviving 1609 pamphlet describes him as living in shameless luxury, surrounded by wealth, while the English crown branded him a traitor and a devil. The name similarity to Sparrow is tempting, almost too tempting, and some say it planted the very first seed of the character centuries before Disney existed. But Jack Ward wasn't a drunken fool, stumbling through his own mutinies. He was calculating, disciplined, almost frighteningly organized in exile. He doesn't explain the chaos. He only explains the name, and maybe the quiet defiance underneath it. For the chaos, you need Calico Jack. His real name was John Rackham, and he earned his nickname from the loud, colorful calico cotton clothing he insisted on wearing into battle, a walking target who somehow refused to die for years. He is the man most historians credit with popularizing the classic skull and crossbones flag, the Jolly Roger that every child now draws on their notebook without knowing whose blood built its reputation. Rackham was reckless. He was vain. He surrounded himself with a crew that included two of the most dangerous women ever to sail under a black flag, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, both of whom reportedly fought harder, cursed louder, and drank heavier than most of the men aboard. Rackham's downfall came in October 1720, when his ship was ambushed by a Jamaican privateer sloop in a small cove off the coast of Negril. According to the sworn testimony recorded at his trial in Spanish Town, most of his crew, including Rackham himself, were below decks, roaring drunk on captured rum when the attack came. Only Anne Bonny and Mary Read stood on deck, swinging cutlasses at the boarding party, screaming down into the hold for the men to come up and fight like pirates instead of hiding like frightened children. Not one man answered the call. Rackham was hanged shortly after at Gallows Point in Port Royal. Legend claims that when Anne Bonny was allowed to see him one final time before his execution, she told him that if he had fought like a man, he wouldn't have had to die like a dog. It's one of the coldest lines in all of pirate history, and historians still debate whether she actually said it, but it captures something painfully real about the era. Recklessness and cowardice lived inside the exact same men, sometimes within the exact same hour, sometimes within the exact same bottle of rum. Anne Bonny and Mary Read deserve their own story here, because their courage that night wasn't a one-time miracle. Mary Read had spent years of her life disguised as a man, first as a soldier fighting in Flanders, then as a sailor on a merchant vessel, long before she ever drifted into piracy under Rackham's flag. Court testimony from the trial describes both women dressed in men's jackets and trousers, cutlasses drawn, cursing down into the hold at the drunken crew to come up and fight like they still had something worth fighting for. When Read was sentenced to hang alongside the men, she reportedly told the court that piracy would never truly end so long as men were hanged for it, because for people like her, the punishment for piracy was no worse than the poverty that had driven her to sea in the first place. Both women escaped the noose only because they were pregnant at the time of sentencing, a legal technicality that spared their lives, while every man standing beside them swung. So, which one is Jack Sparrow really built from? The answer is unsettling. He's neither one of them, and he's both of them at once. He's the myth that gets constructed when history gets retold enough times, around enough campfires and enough tavern tables, that the drunken failure and the legendary swashbuckler slowly blur into a single, unforgettable, impossible face. Now we get to the part of this story that sounds too insane to be true, and yet it's sitting quietly inside courtroom transcripts, ship logs, and execution records that are nearly 300 years old. Golden Age pirate crews did not fight sober, and this wasn't an accident of poor discipline. Rum wasn't a treat aboard these ships. It was practically a food group, rationed out daily like bread and salt pork. And when the Royal Navy finally caught up with the most feared pirates in the Caribbean, more than a few of history's bloodiest confrontations were decided not purely by cannon fire, but by exactly how drunk each side happened to be when the first shot rang out. Take Blackbeard, the single most terrifying name in the entire Golden Age of piracy. Edward Teach didn't just drink before battle, he performed drunkenness and horror as a weapon, turning his own body into a piece of psychological theater. Survivors described him tying lit slow match fuses into his enormous black beard so that thick smoke curled around his face during a boarding action, making him look like a demon crawling straight up from the ocean floor to collect a debt. One infamous account, recorded by Captain Charles Johnson decades later, claims that during a night of heavy drinking below deck, Blackbeard casually blew out the only candle in the cabin, pulled out 2 pistols beneath the table, and fired at his own men in total darkness, crippling one crewman in the knee for the rest of his life. When asked afterward why he'd done it, Blackbeard reportedly answered that if he didn't shoot one of his own crew every now and then, they would forget who exactly he was. That's not the behavior of a calm, calculated leader running a business. That's a man who had stopped fearing consequences entirely because rum, reputation, and repetition had already convinced him he was invincible. And for a terrifyingly long stretch of years off the coast of the Carolinas, he was right. But the story that truly earns the title Too Drunk to Die belongs to Bartholomew Roberts' crew, one of the most successful pirate fleets in recorded history, credited with capturing well over 400 merchant ships across a career that terrorized 3 continents. When the Royal Navy warship Swallow finally cornered Roberts off the coast of West Africa in February 1722, Roberts himself was struck through the throat by a burst of grape shot and killed almost instantly, his body wrapped in sailcloth and thrown overboard by his own weeping crew so the enemy could never claim it as a trophy or parade it through London in chains. What happened next is the part nobody expects. Roberts had strictly forbidden excessive drinking before any engagement, one of the rare captains in the entire Golden Age disciplined enough to enforce sobriety in a crisis. But without their captain, panic and raw grief took over almost instantly, and dozens of his men broke into the rum stores within the hour. By the time the Navy finally boarded the ship, court records from the trial held at Cape Coast Castle describe pirates so intoxicated they could barely stand upright on the deck, several of them laughing, singing sea shanties, and openly mocking their captors as they were dragged in irons toward the makeshift gallows. At the trial itself, witnesses testified under oath that some of the condemned men treated the entire proceeding like a farewell party rather than a sentencing. They shouted insults at the presiding judge. They sang old songs while the formal charges against them were read aloud in Latin and English. One man reportedly asked the executioner for one final drink before the noose was tightened around his neck, and astonishingly, he got it. When the trapdoor finally dropped, according to the horrified clerk recording the proceedings for the Admiralty, several of the men were, by his own written account, still grinning. 52 pirates were executed across that single trial, one of the largest mass hangings in the entire history of British colonial law, an event so large that gallows had to be specially reinforced to handle the volume. And multiple surviving accounts agree on one deeply bizarre detail. Fear, the one emotion that should have consumed every single one of them in their final moments on Earth, simply wasn't there. Whether that missing fear came from the rum from denial, from exhaustion, or from something darker buried in the human mind under enough pressure. Historians still argue about it heatedly today. There's one more story worth telling here, smaller in scale, but just as strange. A pirate named William Fly, hanged in Boston Harbor in 1726, reportedly climbed the gallows ladder himself without being pushed, calmly adjusted the noose because he felt the hangman had tied it incorrectly, and lectured the crowd on proper knot tying before the platform dropped beneath him. Whether that was rum, pride, or pure theater performed for a captive audience, it tells you something essential about how these men had learned to face the very end of everything. Not with silence, with a performance. Before we get to the rum itself, it's worth pulling apart a few more pieces of the Jack Sparrow costume, because almost every prop attached to him carries a real and often much darker history underneath the joke. The parrot on the shoulder, for instance, wasn't pirate fashion. It was pirate cargo. Sailors returning from the Caribbean and the East Indies discovered that exotic birds fetched enormous prices in European ports, sometimes more than an entire month's wages for a common sailor. A parrot riding on your shoulder wasn't a quirky companion. It was a walking paycheck you hadn't sold yet, kept alive and fed specifically so it could be auctioned off the moment the ship made land. Buried treasure. The entire X marks the spot fantasy is almost pure fiction, and it comes from almost a single source. Captain William Kidd, executed in London in 1701, really did bury a portion of his loot on Gardiner's Island in New York before his arrest, hoping to use it as a bargaining chip for his own freedom. It didn't work. He was hanged anyway, and his body was left to rot in a gibbet cage over the River Thames as a public warning to every sailor who passed beneath it. But because Kidd's small stash was real and became famous, an entire genre of fiction, starting with Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island a century and a half later, convinced the world that every pirate buried chests of gold on secret islands. In reality, pirates spent their money almost as fast as they stole it, usually within days, in the taverns and brothels of port towns like Nassau and Port Royal. A pirate with buried treasure was a pirate who had somehow resisted the one thing every pirate crew was famous for, and walking the plank, almost entirely a myth invented decades after the Golden Age ended. Executing a captured sailor by simply throwing him overboard, shooting him, or marooning him on a barren island was faster, cheaper, and didn't require sacrificing a perfectly good plank of ship's timber that could be used for repairs. The plank walk shows up in exactly one or two disputed accounts from the entire era, yet it became the single most iconic image of piracy in the popular imagination, proof that the myths we remember best are rarely the ones that were actually common. So was Jack Sparrow's endless, obsessive love affair with rum just a punchline? Why is the rum gone? Just a joke thrown in for the kids in the theater, a running gag and nothing more, not even close. Clean drinking water on a wooden ship in the 1700s was almost impossible to maintain across a long voyage. Stored for weeks or months in wooden casks below deck, water quickly turned green, grew algae along the walls of the barrel, developed a slimy film, and became genuinely dangerous, sometimes fatal, to drink. Entire crews on merchant and naval vessels were regularly wiped out by dysentery and cholera-like illnesses caused by nothing more than contaminated drinking water. Rum, on the other hand, simply didn't spoil the same way. Mixed with water to create a diluted drink the Royal Navy officially called grog, it killed a significant amount of the bacteria in the water, masked the increasingly foul taste, and kept a crew hydrated enough to survive long ocean crossings without dysentery, quietly wiping out half the ship before a single cannon was even fired. fired. In a very real sense, the pirates who drank the most weren't reckless fools, ignoring their own safety. They were following the only reliable, repeatable survival strategy actually available to them in an era before germ theory existed. Rum also served a second, far darker function beyond hydration. It was liquid courage in the most literal sense possible, dulling the exact part of the human brain that screams at you to run the moment cannon fire rips through the hull beside you. A crew that charged into a boarding action stone sober had time to calculate the odds in the split second before impact, and the odds, brutally, were almost always terrible. A crew half drunk on rationed rum simply stopped calculating entirely. They didn't weigh survival probabilities. They just charged, screaming, into whatever waited for them on the other ship. That is the real, unglamorous, deeply human truth hiding underneath Jack Sparrow's ever-present bottle. It wasn't comedy dressed up for a family audience. It was survival dressed up as comedy 300 years later for viewers who never had to actually drink the water to know why the rum mattered so much in the first place. Here's where the story turns again, because not every drunk pirate the history books remember was actually drunk at all. Some of them were running a much colder, much smarter kind of performance. Henry Morgan, one of the most successful privateers in Caribbean history, and later a knighted governor of Jamaica, understood something that modern advertising executives would recognize instantly if you explained it to them today. Reputation is a weapon in its own right, and fear is a currency that can be spent before a single shot is ever fired. Morgan cultivated a public image of savage, drunken unpredictability, allowing rumors of cruelty and chaos to spread through Spanish colonial towns for months before his ships ever actually appeared on the horizon. Multiple Spanish governors surrendered entire fortified towns without a single shot being fired, simply because the legend of Henry Morgan had already terrified them far more effectively than his actual cannons ever could have. That's the trick almost nobody tells you about the Golden Age of Piracy. Madness, whether real or carefully performed, was a strategy, and a highly effective one. A captain who seemed unpredictable, who might execute you on a whim, ransom you for profit, or simply get so drunk he forgot your existence entirely, was far more terrifying to face than a disciplined, rational enemy you could actually study and plan against. Jack Sparrow's chaotic charm, his refusal to follow any rule, any code, any single expectation placed on him by friend or enemy alike, is a direct descendant of this exact same 300-year-old psychological warfare. The pirates who survived the longest, historically speaking, weren't always the strongest fighters on the deck. They were the ones nobody, not even their own crew, could ever fully predict. Even the compass Jack Sparrow carries in the films, the one that famously doesn't point north, but instead points toward whatever the holder desires most, captures something true buried underneath the fantasy. Real pirates of the era were often driven less by treasure maps and more by desperation, revenge, and the simple desire to never again bow to a captain who treated them as less than human. The compass is fiction. The hunger underneath it wasn't, but performed madness and real madness were not the same thing, and the era's history is careful to remind us of the difference. Where Morgan calculated his cruelty for maximum political effect, a captain like Edward Lowe showed the world what happened when the performance stopped being a performance at all. Lowe was reportedly responsible for burning ships with their crews still locked below deck, cutting off lips and ears for his own amusement, and forcing captured captains to eat their own severed body parts before he killed them. Even other pirate crews, men who had already chosen a life outside the law, refused to sail near him, There was no code strong enough to survive contact with Lowe's version of chaos. He wasn't calculating fear as a weapon. He simply enjoyed the suffering, and his own crew eventually turned on him, marooning him on a French island rather than continue serving under a man even they no longer recognized as human. Jack Sparrow's version of chaos is the safe, cinematic descendant of Morgan's calculated theater. Nobody ever wrote a family film about Edward Lowe, and for good reason. So, no, Jack Sparrow never existed, not as one single man, standing on one single deck, in one single frozen moment of history that historians could point to and say, there, that's him. He is something stranger and more haunting than a real person. He's an echo stitched together out of a defected privateer who vanished into the Mediterranean and reinvented himself as someone else entirely. A flamboyant thief hanged at Gallows Point in Jamaica, a bearded demon who shot his own crewmen for sport in the pitch darkness, a knighted governor who weaponized his own reputation, and 52 condemned men who sang shanties on their way to the gallows because rum, grief, and defiance had already convinced them that fear was somebody else's problem to carry. The real history behind Jack Sparrow isn't funny, not really. It's men who drank because clean water simply didn't exist for them. It's captains who performed madness because sanity, ironically, got you killed faster in that world. It's a crew of pirates so intoxicated by grief and rationed rum that the hangman's noose barely registered as something real happening to them. Hollywood gave us the wink and the crooked grin. History gave those men the reason. They needed a reason to smile in the first place, standing on the very edge of everything. Strip away the eyeliner, the trinkets, and the soundtrack, and what's left is a far bleaker picture than any theme park ride will ever admit. Most of these men were dead before the age of 40. Some were dead before 30. They didn't retire to a quiet cove with a chest of gold and a parrot on their shoulder. They died of disease, of grape shot, of the noose, or occasionally of their own crew's blade in the dark. The laughter on the gallows wasn't triumph. It was very possibly the only defense these men had left against a world that had already decided how their story would end long before they ever set foot on a plank, real or imagined. Somewhere out there, in the gap between what actually happened 300 years ago and what eventually got written down by men who never sailed a single mile of open ocean, the real Jack Sparrow is still out there, rum bottle in hand, still walking that impossible, staggering line between too drunk to fight and too drunk to die. What do you think? Could any human being actually be that lucky? Or is luck just another word we invented for men who simply stopped being afraid to lose everything? Drop your theory in the comments below and tell me which of these men you think deserves the name the most. If this voyage into the dark, rum-soaked history of piracy kept you hooked until the very last second, smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one. Until then, savvy.